Okay, good afternoon, and welcome to the first installment of the Craig Dobbin Scholar the first installment of this is a bit of a mouthful. First installment of the Craig Dobbin Legacy Scholarship Seminar Series, and our first speaker is Professor Danielle Clarke from University College Dublin. So thank you, Danielle. Danielle has edited and written on a wide range of early modern women writers. She is currently editing the poetry of Lady Anne Southwell with Victoria Burke and Christina
Lukic.
Lukic for the Other Voices series. And today's presentation, Editing Old Texts for New Readers, the Poetry of Anne, Lady Southwell, 1574 to 1636, arises out of her Craig Dobbin, at least partially, her Craig Dobbin Legacy Scholarship, which she worked on with Professor Burke, who's from University of Ottawa, and Professor Lucic, who's from Dalhousie University, while, as we were just speaking about, Danielle was in Halifax in the autumn. So
Brilliant.
take
Thank
it
you.
away, Danielle.
Thank you so much, Paul, and hello to everybody who's in the room and people who've joined us online. My aim here today is to really kind of give an overview of the project in fairly non-technical terms, and just to talk to you a little bit about what we were doing and some of the questions that kind of came up as we went through. So as Paul already said, with Vicky Burke and Christina Lukic, I'm editing the poetry of the early 17th century devotional poet Lady Anne Southwell, 1574-1636, for the Toronto ITA Press series. So as I was saying to Paul earlier on, I'd forgotten that this is also for a Canadian press, so which is a nice other kind of dimension to it. And the series is called The Other Voice, and it publishes editions of texts by women across not just Anglophone text, but text from across all languages, in fact. And it's been going for quite a while now. It's a fairly substantial body of material. Fortuitously, both of my co-editors are based at Canadian universities, Christina at Dalhousie, Vicky at the University of Ottawa, and the call for the Craig Dobbin Legacy Scholarships in this new format couldn't have been more opportune, or in Southwell's terms, providential, as we moved into the phase of the project where in-person collaboration seemed warranted. I mean, I've known Christy and Vicky as scholars of early modern women's writing for some time. We've never worked directly together on a project before, so most of this was done through Zoom, Dropbox, shared files, and so on and so forth. And we had kind of, even prior to this call coming along, we had kind of concluded that there would come a stage in the project where it would be helpful for us all to be in the same room. That didn't quite happen for a variety of reasons, but Christy and I worked together kind of intensively for 2.5 weeks. So the aim of the paper is to outline the work that the fellowship enabled, but also to give you a sense of what editing old text entails, the challenges that the task presents, and why this might matter to current scholarship. I mean, long story short, the kind of subtitle of the subtitle is Editing in an Age of Electronic Reproduction. So the question becomes, well, what does an edition like this do, or what should it do in a context where the primary material is readily available in digitized form? And it's not quite the answer we were expecting, I think. So here's a few, if you could give me the next slide, Paul. So that's us at work. That's me giving my paper in King's College in Halifax. There was sherry. It was, nice. And that is an image of Christina and I. Well, no, not Christina and I, but us at work. Basically, what we did was we had 2 monitors set up, and we will both be working on the same file. We basically went through the body of our edited material pretty much line by line, going, I don't know what she's trying to say here. I don't know what this means, you know. And so one of our biggest challenges was we rely very heavily on the OED for glossing. And as you probably know, the OED now logs you out after about 20 minutes. And even Christy, with her very even-tempered Canadian temperament, eventually started to swear about this. And I kept saying to her, you have to just say every time it's logged you out, oh, lexicography. Anyway, but we moved on from that. If you just give me the next slide, this is Halifax at play. So lovely maple leaf, that's the front of King's College, the public gardens in Halifax, beautiful place. And well, one sample of the extensive range of excellent beer available in Halifax. I'm not a cider drinker, but the cider's apparently even better. So, um, okay, so I'm gonna. So one of the things that we've been kind of trying to think about, I'm just going to move my text forward just so I know which slide I'm on. If you just move on to the next slide here. Yes, so the questions that we've been grappling with really is trying to think, as I say, about what the purpose of print edition might be in the electronic age. We've made a commitment early on that we did want to do this as a print edition. Many reasons for that, but the short answer really being about sustainability and longevity. So I'm going to start by outlining a little detail about Lady Anne Southwell herself, some of her connections with London and Munster, before moving on to discuss some of the editorial decisions we've made and finishing up with a worked example of our editorial practice. If you would, could you give Tiger one of these? We'll get to it in due course, but thank you. So first of all, I'm just going to describe this is the structure of the paper, very broadly speaking. If I could have the next slide, please, Paul. So I'm just going to talk to you a little bit about the text. So we have two key sources. One is what's described as a miscellany in the Folger Library, the Shakespeare Folger Library. This is made up of a variety of texts in a variety of states. It includes some receipts, it includes some Bible notes, it includes many poems, again, in various states of completion, and so on and so forth. So it is a miscellany, although for me, the term miscellany doesn't really quite describe it adequately, in that it is clearly a motivated compilation with its own internal structure. Now, as I'll talk about a little bit later on, in terms of how we're going to present things in our edition, and we're going to, the tradition has always been to follow what the manuscript dictates. But I think that for certainly an undergraduate or a graduate audience coming to the material for the first time, that makes it very difficult to understand what on earth is going on. So we're actually going to depart from that order. My colleague Vicky is a specialist in miscellanies and manuscript culture. So when Christy and I said, I think we want to organise it not according to the manuscript, we thought she might turn around and say, over my dead body. But she didn't. She said, no, absolutely, it makes absolute sense to do it like that. So I suppose, I mean, even in terms of that kind of idea about, well, how do we present these kind of old texts to new readers, it's about trying to shape what's there into forms that are coherent or manageable for a beginning reader. Okay, and if you could just show me the next slide. So this is Folger again. So in the Folger manuscript, there are also drafts, deletions. These are in Southwell's hand. Most of it's not in her hand. Most of it is scribal. It gives us insights, obviously, into working method. And here you might see, so she writes, generally speaking, in sixanes. But you might note the way that this is kind of shaped into stanzas, even though you've got all of these kind of deletions and so on. And I know Anna's kind of been working around this kind of idea about kind of early modern women and aging and the aging process. So I was kind of intrigued by this manuscript because I couldn't quite work out. A lot of the hands are scribal. I mean, just go back to the previous slide for a minute there, Paul. So you see this. So this is fairly neatly copied out. And go back to the next one. Thank you. This is a terrible hand. I mean, it's really very difficult to read, almost to the point of illegibility or incoherence. Absolutely. So there's something motivated going on here. So I'm going to sit here thinking, well, what's going on here? I mean, you have, and you'll see some examples in a minute, you have a considerable body of work by a woman poet who is highly literate, is interested in all sorts of intellectual debates, but seemingly can't write, right? So what do we do with that? And then I was thinking, well, so her date, she was born in 1574. Her children are born in the early 1600s. So by the time most of this material is being compiled, 1620s, so she's in her 50s. So my assumption is, and I'm going out on a limb here, but I'm assuming that she probably had very severe arthritis and actually couldn't use her pen. That's a speculation, but I think it's an interesting one that you can kind of map onto the page in a certain kind of way. Okay, so and then if you could just go on to the next one. So this is the other manuscript. This is in the British Library. This is the Lansdowne manuscript, 740. It's a substantial manuscript of 17th century verse. And in it, it's what's called a sammelband, so essentially booklets bound together. The bulk of it consists of a verse miscellany, 17th century poems by Donne, Overbury, and others. And these are kind of writers to whom Southwell does seem to have had some tenuous connection. It's not quite clear how her two versions of the commandments, Commandment 3 and 4, end up in this manuscript. We don't really know why they're there. Mark Bland says it was put together in the 1680s and that the constituent parts are quite independent of one another. And I agree with that. Somebody in the 1680s thought there's a sort of vague thematic link between all of these things. We'll just bung them all together. And if you just do the next one. So you can see here, this is Bland says this is Southwell's text, a separate booklet in two hands, and you can see the way that it's tipped into the manuscript there, that it's actually, so what they would do quite often, and we find this all the time across a whole range of early modern women's manuscripts, that they're written into often homemade books. So you buy your Quira paper, you fold it in half, you stitch it down the edge, and so these are paper books, what are called paper books. And we find them in all sorts of places. Okay, so I'm just going to move on then. So Southwell's mercurial, metaphysical, and highly intellectual poetry is interested in many things: theology, devotion, the nature of the divine, the natural world, providence, and its relationship to faith and scripture, how to apply divine precepts to lived experience in the world. Her poems also participate in the discourses and rhetoric associated with the plantation, religious and legal reform of early 17th century Ireland, which I will discuss briefly. I have a forthcoming article about this. Her poetry exhibits a wide range of reading and knowledge and an intellectual effort to reconcile these forms of knowledge, classical, scientific, philosophical, with Christian devotion, resulting in a deeply typological interpretation of the world. As she states, quote, try Seneca and Paul with one touchstone, weigh Aristotle with wise Solomon. So Seneca and Paul, Aristotle and Solomon. The term touchstone is quite interesting because she's very interested in alchemy. So the image here, and this is typical of her, the image here is of trying an element against a touchstone to ascertain its authenticity. So that's a very typical, it's just two lines, but it's very typical of the way that all of the kind of dimensions of her thought come together. Her use of language is complex, synthesizing and metastasizing the scriptures, which provide both the ground and the boundary to her thought. As Kevin Killeen has written in a forthcoming chapter, for a writer like Southwell, quote, scriptural history bore down on the present and spoke of battles past and never finished. Southwell's writing incorporates the local, the typic, and the apocalyptic, not only in continual dialogue, but as urgent reiterations of the same divine tune. It's interesting that Killeen uses the term tune because one of the things that she's very interested in music as an image of divine harmony and numbers and mathematics and arithmetic. And again, that's something I've just been working on. So I'll just give you a very brief kind of bio of her, just so you can kind of situate her in time and place. If I could have the next slide, please, Paul. Thank you very much. So she was born in 1573 or 4 in Devon to Sir Thomas Harris and Elizabeth Pomeroy. Elizabeth Harris was herself the product of a socially advantageous marriage. So this was a kind of a rising gentry family. He was a lawyer, which becomes significant later on in terms of their Irish context. She has one brother, Edward, who ends up being the Lord Chief Justice to the Council of Munster. So they both end up in Ireland, and there's a kind of long history there. So Harris, her husband, possessed land near to that owned by Sir Walter Raleigh in Devon, and he also, of course, owned land in Munster, where Anne's first husband, Thomas Southwell, was to pursue his ambitions. Thomas Southwell was from Norfolk, was descended from the Cornwallis family, many of whom were recusants. Robert Southwell, the noted devotional poet, Jesuit, and saint, was Thomas Southwell's uncle. which again frames Southwell's anti-Catholicism quite interestingly, I think. A copy of his best-selling volume of poetry, Sir Peter's Complaint, is named in the list of books found in the Folger manuscript. There's a long book list of about 120 items in the manuscript. Widely read by Protestants as well as Catholics, St. Peter's Complaint turns up everywhere in early modern culture. This model for poetic articulation of the divine was clearly important to Anne, supplemented by the poems of the likes of Donne and Herbert, even if she was very keen to advertise her strong opposition to Catholicism wherever possible. Like many without secure incomes or lands in England, Thomas Southwell sought to pursue opportunities on both sides of the Irish Sea, although the evidence from Anne's writings suggests their uncanny ability to back the wrong horse in any given situation. There appear to be some connections which became increasingly tenuous as time goes on, no doubt exacerbated by distance once the Southwells took up residence in Pullenon Castle, not far from Kinsale, County Cork. If you could just go on to the next slide there. That's her mum and dad. So this is Inishannon, this is Bandon and Shippool, and the castle was just here. And if you just show the next slide, that's the remains now of Pullenon Castle. Her husband was knighted by King James in July 1603, and Lady Anne allegedly travelled to Berwick to meet the Queen. Something about this trip was clearly amiss, and she was ordered to return, this line of preferment having apparently met with a rebuff of some kind. Southwell's letter to Henry Carey, Viscount Falkland, Lord Deputy of Ireland, until his recall in 1628, interestingly, the letter wasn't addressed to his wife Elizabeth Carey, at this point a very public convert to Catholicism, is an effort to reciprocate the favour done to her second husband, Captain Henry Sibthorpe, possibly with an eye to future opportunities. Again, Southwell's timing seems injudicious, coinciding as it does with Falkland's demotion. Two interesting things about this. When Christy and I were working through, I think it's precept 3 or maybe precept 4, we came across a passage which uses the quite unusual early modern uses of the verb prejudicate. And I'm like, that's very familiar. And this turns up in Carey's play, Mariam. And the whole passage, there's about 3 or 4 stanzas that talk about the circumstances of divorce, Herod. She had clearly read Carey's Mariam, which I find really fascinating. And then the second thing is that the letter that she writes, the sort of slightly sycophantic letter she writes to Falkland, says, well, I would play the critic with the term in your letter. And I thought, what is this letter? What letter is she responding to? And it turns out that Falkland, once he was disgraced and removed from the position of Lord Deputy, wrote this incredibly kind of grovelly letter saying to James, basically saying, I'm a lowly worm, I'm so sorry, please be nice to me. Is it James or Charles? It kind of crosses over. And it's just very interesting because her letter clearly reflects that wording. So there's a lot that's inevitably, there's a whole kind of textual substructure that you can kind of partially reconstruct in terms of the kind of the framing of what she's doing. Okay, so attempts to close the distance between herself, potential patrons or allies, and to consolidate the social status to which the family aspired are evident in the various poems copied into the Folger manuscript, despite a frequent return to the idea that worldly aspirations are an obstacle to a pure relationship with God. He, she says, that requires the acquaintance of great personages pursues his own slavery. I had rather lie at ease upon my own pallet than kneel by another's, she writes in one apothegm. The hedging of bets between emerging players in Ireland and the attempt to keep earlier English connections alive is a typical manoeuvre found in other planter families, from Richard Boyle, Earl of Cork, who she knew, through to families of more modest means. Ideas of social authorship and display challenge conventional notions of authorship and circulation. The mock elegy addressed to Cecily Ridgway, née McWilliams, once again misses its mark, as the recipient was indeed dead by the time the poem was sent. Sarah C.E. Ross suggests that Southwell, like Ridgway, may have served as a lady in waiting to Elizabeth I, and the similarities between their lives is striking, despite the disparity in social status. Ridgway's husband was made an earl in 1622, in stark contrast to the failure of Sir Thomas Southwell to reach high office. I mean, her husband, the Earl of Londonderry, was totally dodgy. I mean, he was on the make and he took money and he was censured by Star Chamber and all of the other things. There's a wonderful letter in the National Library, which which the Earl of Londonderry sent not long after his elevation to the earldom, and he signs it at the bottom, Londonderry, but the letters are about this high. It's like, I am an earl. Anyway, so in June 1626, Sir Thomas Southwell died, and shortly afterwards, Lady Anne married Captain Henry Sibthorpe, who she'd clearly known before then. There's a kind of mystery about this. I mean, he's very much her social inferior. Other Sibthorpes were also present in Ireland. Richard officiated at the marriage of Joan Boyle and the Earl of Kildare and was later the Bishop of Limerick. Henry had been active in Ireland as a soldier and made his reputation at Cadiz, and the Essex connection runs all through this circle. The rapidity of the marriage suggests that they were already known to one another. There's ample hints in the poems that Southwell's first marriage was unhappy. Sibthorpe was her socially inferior and younger than her, but the evidence of the Folger manuscript with its commendatory verses and eulogies, as well as his careful co-production of her work, testifies to shared interests and sympathies and a joint effort to maximise the social capital of Southwell's connections and networks. Sibthorpe also contributes a poem in praise of his wife at the end of the Lansdowne manuscript, noting her ability to imitate and her desire to know God, and asserting, quote, these grave and holy meditations as, quote, sweet recreations, not the works of the Folger title with its implication of literary aspiration. The monument to the Southwells, which is in St Mary's Church in Acton, which the monument was moved from the old church. It's a newer church. It's interesting that she keeps her Southwell name, and on that it says something about her husband, and having been a member of the Council of Munster. Sibthorpe was never a member of the Council of Munster. Thomas was, but Sibthorpe wasn't. So this is all sort of social capital. The couple returned to England probably in 1628, living in Clerkenwell before moving to Acton in 1631. Here, Southwell appears to have lived quietly, cultivating relationships with the curate of St Mary's, Roger Cox, to whom she addressed a poem praising his Hebdomada Sacra 1630, a hexameral poem based on St Matthew's Gospel, and a likely model for her, or analogue for her own verse meditations on the Decalogue. Also dating from this period is a brief note made on one of Cox's sermons, also taken from St Matthew, preached on the 3rd of February 1632. So just to kind of pivot a little bit, I'm actually going to skip the bit on Southwell and Ireland. I'm happy to talk about it afterwards, but it is quite interesting. But I would like to pay tribute to the vision of Margaret King and Albert Rabil inaugurating the series of which this edition will be a part, and to the various people at The Other Voice, especially Elizabeth Hageman and Jamie Goodrich, who've lent their support to this less than straightforward project. Southwell's writing challenges several standard editorial conventions, not least the model of copy, text, and variant, ideas of singular authorship, and notions of final intentions. Southwell is a serial recycler of her own work, kind of putting passages that she likes to new purpose. And that passage we saw that was in her own hand is kind of a tryout. So all the parts of the text are kind of mobile and can be moved around in a variety of ways. So my presentation will focus on the challenges presented by her extant corpus as a way of raising the questions about the purpose and function of editions in the age of electronic reproduction. I'll ask some questions about how ideas about editing and the purpose of an edition are inflected by the digital environment into which such editions will be read, such editions will be read and interpreted, and some of the paradoxes that this presents. In effect, I suggest the more prolific the available text and resources, by which I mean unedited text and resources, the more directive an edition needs to be, particularly if it's aimed at readers whose interest is not solely or exclusively textual. I mean, there are lots of nerdy people who are very interested in, which pages are tipped in and why they're the wrong way around and so on and so forth. But this has proved over the last, there was a diplomatic edition produced in 1997 by Sister Jean Clean, who did an amazing job, and without it, none of this work would be possible. But it is also the case that diplomatic edition is a very significant barrier to engaging with the text, and people have become perhaps slightly obsessed with the material dimensions of these texts rather than the text as poems. So that point really about, you know, the need for direction was really forcefully brought home as Christy and I sat down at parallel computers in her study to read over our prepared text side by side. We spent a lot of time going, I don't know what this line means. I don't know what this refers to. Is this, you know, should we repunctuate this? How can we make this make sense? So this is a corpus of material that we thought we knew well and that we had some understanding of, but we were wholly unprepared for how demanding annotating these texts was going to be. I mean, it was exhausting. I mean, we literally started at 9:30 in the morning. We took a break for lunch. We worked then from usually 2 till about 6, at which point somebody would inevitably throw up their hands and say, I think we need wine. So hours and hours working through the material line by line, adding, clarifying, attempting to enrich, but also to simplify our annotations. The bottom line, in amongst many other barriers to work like this, is this. Like George Herbert or John Donne or John Milton, Southwell doesn't just allude to her source materials, she inhabits them. As Chana Block writes in relation to Herbert, for Herbert and his contemporaries, quote, the Bible was not merely a work of literature, but the living word of God. Often her scriptural allusions range across different places in the Bible. The early modern habit of collation, of typology, of non-linear reading is evident everywhere. Often she is so familiar with her source that she sees no need to return to it or to quote it accurately. So this gives rise to a mode of writing pretty much alien to most readers. It's an interesting point. I mean, what it suggests is a process of incorporation. That, you know, you incorporate the scripture and the word into your very being, so it actually becomes your own vocabulary. And that was a little surprising to me, that she was quite sloppy about, you know, her quotation. She doesn't quote, she alludes, but she assumes that everybody else will follow her allusion, you know. But it's a mode of writing that is pretty much alien to most modern readers, and that's again a massive challenge for a modern editor, and particularly for a modern editor where, to be frank, the majority of people who are going to be drawn to this material are likely to be drawn to it in the first instance because of the gender of its author. And so I think there's an expectation about kind of accessibility maybe there, which is not borne out by the complexity of this material, which is great in many ways, but it does raise certain kinds of challenges. So here we have a version of the world which views the biblical text as a living wordscape, where words, phrases, and characters are animated by the divine and always remain in excess of human capacity. The natural world, its resources and its patterns, its material and living things are a text to be read for divine revelation and providence. I have a few examples of the way in which the kind of language she uses, particularly around land and agriculture, kind of tie into ideas about kind of colonial practice. I'll just give you a very brief example. She writes to a man called Bernard Adam, who was the Bishop of Limerick, asserting the power of faith, hope, and love to dispel of sin and death, but does this in very concrete terms. If you would just skip forward to, just skip a slide and go to the next one. It's the Epistle to Bernard. Yeah, that's the one. The first is faith, whose eyes like burning tapers, whose fiery wings disperse these foggy vapours, or walking fiery ovens like flowery fields. The fiery ovens are simultaneously a reference to ideas about hell, but they're also, I think, references to lime kilns. So here what we see is an analogue between her language and the fact that Ireland is repeatedly represented in early modern treatises as damp, watery, subject to vapours. The idea of fog is associated with error, lack of wisdom, and a failure of faith. Quote, she says, with mediocrity assist my flight as free from fogs, as far from wings to light. Dampness pervades Southwell's poetry. She argues that the ear's tunnel shape makes it particularly susceptible to Satan's breathing, breathless death. The ear is broad to receive and narrow to retain the infectious damp that poisoned every vein. When Southwell rouses her soul to action, to cast off this stupid lethargy of sense and go to God's house, this is contrasted with being bogged in diffidence, where here being sunk and entangled in a bog or quagmire is used figuratively. Reform tracts on Ireland often use this image of the bog as a correlative for ignorance and apostasy. Parr Lane, in his poem News from the Holy Isle, writes, "Who thinks fit that Reformation's hand should drain the bogs that conquer thus this land," conjoining a topographical feature with spiritual status. So these are kind of minor points, I suppose, of common usage, but I've got plenty more of them, but I won't go into them right now. I mean, my favorite one is each where, what's the next one? No, I don't have it. It doesn't matter. Each where I see how ignorance hath hurled her foggy mantle upon all their strands, I will not dare to judge their mysteries, yet will I ever fly their villainies. The foggy mantle as a metaphorical articulation of ignorance finds powerful echoes in the kinds of polemical writings that Southwell's kin and social network were sending back to the Crown and the Privy Council. A mantle is obviously an overcloak, particularly associated in the early modern period with deceit and rebellion in Scotland and Ireland. Spencer's Irenaeus, for example, describes the functions of the mantle as, quote, a fit house for an outlaw, a meet bed for a rebel, an apt cloak for a thief. So these minor points of common usage point to the key elements of this reform agenda: religion, law, and land use, indexed via the visual appearance of landscapes and their resource potential, if appropriately managed. So this gives perhaps, I hope anyway, a sense of the larger cultural and textual environment in which Southwell's poems circulated and from which they derive their meaning. The challenge for us as editors boils down to relevance. What does the reader need to make sense of the text? But balancing that off with not being overly directive. That's the real challenge. How much to direct, suggest, intervene? How possible is it to reproduce through our annotation the intellectual world of somebody like Southwell? So moving on then, so just thinking about what the purpose of an edition of poetry is when the primary sources are already in the public domain. What relationship should edited text have to these sources, and what do these extended textual environments mean for how we think of the purpose and usefulness of edited text? Who is editing for? Questions of access and accessibility are central to our thinking and to the approach that we adopted. Rather than attempting to explicate the author, we're aiming to produce a version of her poetry that can function as an interface between readers and text, potentially including the digital editions. You can access that Folger manuscript in its entirety online on the Folger website. The Lansdowne one has been digitized, but I haven't seen hair nor hide of it since the cyber attack, so I don't know what's happened to that. And Clean's diplomatic edition is also available on Internet Archive. So you can put all of these things together. So the argument is that the edition will be read in the context of these other things. The latter, if you like, the digital editions and Clean's edition, are part of an extended suite of resources for teachers who wish to use the edition in any number of creative ways. If you like, the edition, we hope, is a key to these other materials, not in any sense a replacement for them, although for many readers that ours will be the starting point, and they will see no reason to go back to these resources. Okay, so I'm just going to move on now to the issues. No, that's my fault though. Just move on to, we've done that one, move on to, yeah, that one, perfect, thank you. So the issue, so you see here, we have a text written upside down. It's a fragment on a paper. This is from Lansdowne. So I've talked a little bit about the two texts. The fact that Folger has a book list, an inventory, sermon notes, notes from Southwell's reading, written in a number of hands, including some drafts and corrections in Southwell's own hand. I'm giving a paper in Leiden in May on the kind of scribal production part of this, which is actually very interesting in a domestic setting. There's at least 7 or 8 separate hands in this manuscript, and it mostly seems to be household servants, people who worked for them. Poems range across forms and genres, often working with hybrids as well as utilising poetic forms that engage integrally with Southwell's processes of thought, assimilating her wide reading, her observations of the natural world, and the scriptural and theological habitus that inflects and informs all dimensions of her poetic practice. That manuscript is scribally produced and raises important questions about date and paratexts. It includes a dedicatory poem to James I. We think it's to James I. Timing wise, the dating is very erratic. It's very hard to date the poems precisely. And she has a line later in the poem about how the monarch was born a thistle and made a rose. So that's a kind of allusion to his Scottish birth. Yes, exactly. Yeah, no, precisely. So both texts represent different kinds of editorial challenges, of which the relationship between the two is perhaps one of the least contentious. In other words, Lansdowne has two extended versions of poems that are also in Folger, some of it which are the same, some of which are expanded. The difficulty is working out which direction the traffic is moving in. My feeling is that Lansdowne is later than Folger, but that wouldn't be universally agreed. But they seem to me to be more worked over, more coherent versions that make their way into Lansdowne. Poems are bound in and mostly consist of single or folded leaves, suggesting that these are the Decalogue poems. So these are poems based on the Ten Commandments. And she says in one of them, in 4, I think she says, around stanza 88, she says, "I have nearly reached my hundreds bound." So what she's thinking of is 10 poems of 100 stanzas to kind of reflect that kind of Decalogue pattern. Yeah.
Is that a poem written and then folded like a note to give to somebody?
No, no, it's upside down, and it's actually part of it. It's not a single leaf. It's part of that little booklet. And it may just be that that's where it started and it got flipped at some point. So she never produced this full sequence of verse meditations on the 10 Commandments. We have versions of 7 of the 10 of them. Dating and sequencing is unclear. In Folger, the majority of the Decalogue poems are tipped in. I don't know if you mean that. That means basically kind of like just pasted into an existing book. So in other words, they had an independent existence as single or folded sheets. Those in Lansdowne precede and follow a single gallery, and we talked about this a little bit earlier. It suggests that they were copied from a separate working copy that was on loose leaves. One of our first problems with all of this is that it's not autograph. And secondly, a series of corrections have been made throughout. So, Paul, if you would just move 2 slides on. You can just see there that corrections, this has been crossed through, some of the stanzas are being crossed through. Again, this is a real problem for an editor because they've been crossed through, but many of the stanzas which have been crossed through, and I've seen this in other women's manuscripts, are often the materials that might be seen to be slightly more controversial or engage overtly with questions of gender. Do we leave them in? Do we leave them out? If we leave them in, then that messes up her 100 model. So I think it's precept 4. With her deletions, with the ones that are marked to be excised, it comes out as 101. But if you put the other ones back in, it's 106, which makes no sense. So what do you do? I mean, my principle is really keep as much as possible, but that's a different question. Here, so what we have here is a correction of the word nettled hens fly into thistles and forsake their charge, bury their talent and reject their friends. And somebody, one of the scribes, has written in tharsis instead of thistle. So this is a very domestic image of hens nettled, bothered by nettles, but also contained. And somebody comes along and writes tharsis. And if you just go on to the next slide, this is a clear reference to Jonah. And she has a copy of Calvin's commentaries on Jonah in her book list. So Jonah rose up to flee in Tarshish from the presence of the Lord, etc., etc., etc. And at the bottom is the annotation. This is part of an extended and deleted passage on the family of love, where Southwell critiques them as deformed reformers of the word, whose threat to the church and public order exceeds that of popish bulls or Roman sword. Its adherents focus so minutely on textual matters, she suggests, that they risk missing the larger picture. "'Tis most pure piety makes them move all the cornerstone, though all the fabric falls." So this is kind of interesting. The Geneva Commentary makes the example of relevance clear of Tarshish, whereby he declared his weakness that would not promptly follow the Lord's calling, but gave place to his own reason. That's what she's saying the family of love are doing. This heightening intervention, though, alters the orientation and impact of Southwell's text, aligning it with a specific exemplary story, making explicit what was left implicit. The change is based on two lines of connection, somatic and aural, the latter based on the partial homophone thistle tharsis, but also on an effort to connect the homely image to a larger and more authoritative narrative. This kind of scribal co-production needs to be registered at the level of representation of text on the page, and we've tried to reflect those changes as best we can whilst also providing a clean text. Sometimes it's not quite possible to decide. So just very briefly then, if we just move on to editorial principles, that's not the next slide, that one, yeah, perfect. That's it, yeah, you got it? No, the next one? Yeah, this one. So focus on accessibility, removing barriers to understanding, providing usable copy text, but to try and preserve some element of the mobile, recycled nature of Southwell's writing. A very good example of this is that there's two poems. There's this poem to Bernard Adam, and then there's a poem which is called Sir, Give Me Leave to Plead My Grandam's Cause. And some of the same material turns up in each poem. They've been put in the manuscript in the wrong order, so you have to rejig them. And while we were working through them, it just became really clear to me that these are companion pieces. One is about Adam and one is about Eve, and they're supposed to be read in conjunction with one another. But that wouldn't be obvious unless you reordered it and went with, so you have to kind of make an intervention, more intervention than perhaps contemporary editorial practice would suggest. The primary focus, there's other material in this manuscript, but we've decided to focus very much on poetry and poetry adjacent materials, and then to try and embrace a practice editorially that embraces collaboration and interpretive openness rather than fixed copy. That was an aspiration. We've had to dump a bit of that, actually. We did actually have to say, no, this is what we think this means. It's not really fair just to leave all of this up to the reader. Inclusion and exclusion. So this is the next slide. I'm nearly finished now. So I mentioned at the beginning that we decided not to follow the order of the manuscript. So what we've decided to do is to group together all of the Decalogue poems from Folger and from Lansdowne. So they will all sit together. Christy had worked out there's 3 poems in Folger, and Christy has, and I think very convincingly, argued that these are 3 different versions of the first commandment, and therefore they belong together. There is a letter to Lady Ridgway, which is a defense of poetry, really interesting piece of writing, unprecedented in early modern women's writing. The letters to Ridgway and Falkland, the book list and inventory, the apothegms and Sibthorpe's memorial verses. And we could just move finally to this slide here. So this is the order. Letter to Ridgway, which kind of sets the thing up. Decalogue poems, elegies and epitaphs, songs and sonnets, invective, critique and defence, classical paraphrase and biography, prose text, memorial verses on Southwell, and the inventories and book lists. So that's how it will kind of sit together. Yeah. So that's the plan, really. And then what I've given to you as a handout is just one example. It's a tiny little, I chose something that would fit on 2 pages because some of the poems are quite long. And so this is, I mentioned the elegy that Southwell writes to Cassandra Cicely McWilliams, the name is wrong there, the wife of Sir Thomas Ridgway, Earl of Londonderry. So she writes this long elegy, which is all imagining, what Ridgway would see when her soul is translated and what she would look down, and can she tell us about the harmony of the spheres and so on. And it's often be thought to be satirical, and it's followed by this poem, which is an epitaph, and that elegy epitaph pattern is something she uses quite a lot, which is an epitaph kind of basically going like, oops, you know, she was dead after all, you know, like, because she says, I didn't hear from you, you know, I didn't hear back from you, which again is interesting, is a verse epistle. So the idea that she'd have an expectation of a response, I think, is quite interesting. So, but this just gives you an example. So each text will come with a head note, which hovers somewhere between description and explanation. Will give some material context for where it occurs in the manuscript, what surrounded it, and so on and so forth. And then you'll see that we have modernized, we've used modern spelling, and we have changed punctuation. And then you'll see that we have a series of interpretive notes, which will be at the bottom of the page. We do have textual notes, and those will be end notes to each poem, and will preserve the old spelling. So some of these are fairly obvious, but sometimes it's a way to kind of help the reader map their way through some quite complex syntax apart from anything else. Punctuation has been our friend, and we've done quite a lot of intervening around a punctuation. So we're now, I would say, about 2/3 to 3/4 of our way through this project. I mean, all of the texts have been completed, the annotations have been completed. What we're doing now is that there are 3 of us, so we're basically, you know, Christina and I worked through the majority of the material together, and Vicky is now reviewing that. We're reviewing some of the poems that she did, and tidying up various things, and we're starting to draft our textual, well, not just our textual introduction, but the interpretive introduction as well. So we're hoping to send it off in the summer sometime. We've been a little bit delayed, but it's been just to kind of come back to the Craig Dobbin, it was an enormously useful thing to be able to spend 2 weeks kind of working intensively on this. And I think a huge amount came out of it for us in terms of enhancing the edition, the decisions we were making. So I'd like to thank ICUF and UCD and the College of Arts and Humanities, and particularly Paul, for all of his work pulling this together and administering the scheme. It really was a professional highlight, I have to say. So thank you.